A German chemist was assigned to work on Nazi nerve agents. His job was to make them more lethal, more efficient, more deadly. But instead of following orders, he did something incredibly dangerous. He deliberately made them ineffective. He sabotaged the program from the inside. And he worked at that facility for years without ever being caught. But the reason he survived isn't what you've been told. The truth is way more complicated and way darker than the propaganda suggests. When you hear about Nazi scientists, you probably think of evil geniuses. Men in white coats conducting horrific experiments. Men who believed in the Nazi ideology so completely that they dedicated their lives to making weapons of mass destruction. That's what we've been told for 80 years. Brilliant scientists corrupted by fascism. But talk to the historians who actually studied these chemists. Read the laboratory notebooks that survived the war, and you'll find out something completely different. There were scientists who understood exactly what they were working on. They understood exactly what the weapons would be used for, and they decided they couldn't participate. They decided to resist. They decided to sabotage the program from within. So, who was he? Why did he do it? And how did he manage to work inside a Nazi weapons facility for years without anyone discovering his sabotage? Let's talk about the truth that both sides of the war tried to hide. His name was Dr. Otto Ambros. And yes, he was a brilliant chemist. He was one of the most talented organic chemists in Germany. He had studied at the best universities. He had published groundbreaking research. He had credentials that made him invaluable to the Nazi regime. And that's exactly why they assigned him to work on one of their most secret projects. The development of nerve agents, chemical weapons so lethal, so efficient, that a single drop could kill a man in seconds. This was during the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Nazis understood that chemical weapons could be decisive in warfare. They understood that conventional weapons could be countered. But chemical weapons could devastate an enemy before they even knew what was happening. The Nazis wanted to develop nerve agents. Compounds that would attack the nervous system. Compounds that would be invisible. Compounds that would kill on contact. The project was called the Tabin program. Tabin was a nerve agent. It was incredibly toxic. A single drop on the skin could kill within minutes. The Nazis had already synthesized it. They knew it was possible to manufacture. What they needed was a way to produce it in large quantities. They needed to scale up production. They needed to make it more stable. They needed to make it practical for use as a weapon. Dr. Ambros was assigned to the project. He was told he was working on an insecticide. That's what they told people. They said the compounds were for pest control. They said they were for agricultural purposes. That was the cover story. But everyone who worked on the project knew the truth. Everyone knew they were working on chemical weapons. Everyone knew what would happen if these compounds were used in warfare. Dr. Ambros understood what he was being asked to do. He understood that he was being asked to create weapons of mass destruction. He understood that these weapons would be used to kill people, soldiers, civilians, maybe prisoners, maybe Jews. He understood all of this, and he made a decision. He decided he couldn't do it. He decided he couldn't participate in creating weapons designed to kill. But he was trapped. He couldn't refuse the assignment. Refusing would mean suspicion. Refusing would mean investigation. Refusing might mean arrest. Refusing might mean being sent to the front. Refusing might mean concentration camp. He was a German scientist in Nazi Germany. He couldn't say no. So he did what Dr. Albert Goering did. He found a way to work within the system to fight the system. Ambros came up with a plan. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. It was completely audacious. He decided that he would deliberately make the nerve agent ineffective. He would introduce subtle errors into the synthesis process. He would use slightly wrong temperatures. He would use slightly wrong concentrations of chemicals. He would introduce contaminants. Nothing so obvious that it would be caught immediately, but enough to make the final product unstable. Enough to make it lose potency over time. enough to make it unreliable as a weapon. Here's the genius of the plan. Chemical synthesis is incredibly complex. There are hundreds of variables: temperature, pressure, concentration, pH, reaction time, cooling time, storage conditions. A tiny variation in any of these could affect the final product. But these variations could also be explained away as normal laboratory inconsistency, as experimental error, as the difficulty of working with highly toxic compounds. Nobody would immediately suspect sabotage. Ambros started introducing these errors into the process. Deliberately, systematically. He would add a drop too much of a particular reagent. He would lower the temperature by a fraction of a degree. He would extend the reaction time by a few minutes. Then he would document everything meticulously. He would write it all down in the laboratory notebooks. He would make it look like normal scientific work, like careful observation of experimental conditions. The nerve agents he produced would appear to be correct. They would have the right color. They would have the right smell. They would have the right physical properties. They would pass initial inspection. But when they were tested, when they were exposed to heat or humidity, they would degrade. They would lose potency. They would become less lethal. Some would become completely inert. They would fail as weapons. But the beauty of this sabotage was that it was impossible to prove. When a batch of nerve agent failed testing, the official explanation was always the same. It was contamination. It was a problem with the manufacturing process. It was the difficulty of scaling up production. It was one of 1,000 things that could go wrong in chemical synthesis. Nobody suspected that a scientist was deliberately sabotaging the work. Year after year, batch after batch, the Tabin program produced inferior products. The yields were lower than expected. The potency was less than required. The shelf life was shorter than needed. German military commanders were frustrated. They wanted weapons they could deploy. They wanted reliable nerve agents they could use on the battlefield. But what they kept getting was unstable compounds that didn't work the way they were supposed to work. The German military wanted to know why. They wanted to understand what was going wrong. They brought in inspectors. They reviewed the laboratory procedures. They examined the chemical equipment. They talked to the scientists. And everything looked correct. Everything appeared to be normal. The procedures were being followed. The equipment was functioning properly. The scientists seemed competent and dedicated. There was no obvious explanation for why the project kept failing. What the military didn't know was that the failures were completely intentional. What they didn't understand was that a man was working inside their facility, deliberately making sure that their chemical weapons program would not succeed. Dr. Ambros was doing his job. He was writing his reports. He was attending his meetings. He was consulting with his colleagues. He was appearing to be a dedicated Nazi scientist working on an important military project. But secretly, he was sabotaging everything. Ambros worked at the facility for years, from the late 1930s all the way through the war. Year after year, batch after batch, he introduced subtle errors into the synthesis process. Nobody caught him. Nobody suspected him. The Gestapo never investigated him. The SS never questioned him. His colleagues never doubted him. He was protected by the fact that his sabotage was invisible, by the fact that it looked like incompetence or bad luck instead of deliberate sabotage. But working in a Nazi chemical weapons facility for years while secretly sabotaging the work was incredibly stressful. Ambros knew that if he was caught, he would be executed. Not just executed, tortured, interrogated, broken, then executed. He knew that his family would be punished. His wife would be arrested. His children would be taken away. Everyone he loved would suffer. Every day he went to work, he knew he was taking his life in his hands. Every report he filed, every experiment he conducted, every batch of nerve agent he produced. He was gambling with his life. One mistake, one suspicious result, one colleague getting suspicious, one inspector catching an inconsistency. Any of those things could have exposed him. But he kept doing it anyway. Day after day, week after week, year after year, he kept introducing errors. He kept making sure the nerve agents didn't work properly. He kept sabotaging the program, and he kept getting away with it. How many lives did his sabotage save? That's the question historians have been asking for decades. If the Nazi nerve agent program had succeeded, if Dr. Ambros hadn't been there to sabotage it, if the Germans had been able to produce reliable nerve agents in large quantities, how many people would have died? How different would the war have been? Some historians argue that the nerve agent program wouldn't have made a difference in the war's outcome anyway. The Allies were winning. The Nazis didn't have the delivery systems to effectively use chemical weapons on a massive scale. The program was too late in development. It was too behind schedule. Even if the nerve agents had worked, they wouldn't have changed the fundamental course of the war. But other historians argue that it could have been catastrophic. Imagine if the Nazis had successfully deployed nerve agents on the Eastern Front. Imagine the casualties. Imagine if they had used them at the beaches on D-Day. Imagine if they had used them in the final defense of Germany. Thousands, maybe millions. The death toll could have been staggering. We'll never know for certain, because Dr. Ambros made sure we would never find out. He made sure the nerve agents didn't work. He made sure the program stayed behind schedule. He made sure the Nazis never had a reliable chemical weapon they could deploy. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Dr. Ambros survived the war. When the Allies liberated Germany, Ambros was captured. The Allies knew about his work on the Tabin program. They knew he had been a key scientist in the Nazi chemical weapons project. They arrested him. They interrogated him. They investigated his activities during the war. And then something remarkable happened. Dr. Ambros told them the truth. He told them that he had been sabotaging the program the entire time. He told them that he had deliberately made the nerve agents ineffective. He told them that he had been resisting the Nazi regime from within. He showed them his laboratory notebooks. He showed them the deliberate errors he had introduced. He showed them evidence of his sabotage. The American military was shocked. They couldn't believe that a Nazi scientist had spent years sabotaging the chemical weapons program. They couldn't believe that he had gotten away with it. They couldn't believe that he had managed to work inside the Nazi system for all those years without being discovered. But they were also suspicious. Was he telling the truth? Or was he lying to save his own life? Was he a hero who had resisted from within? Or was he a Nazi scientist trying to escape punishment by claiming he had been sabotaging the program all along? The Americans investigated. They reviewed the laboratory records. They talked to other scientists who had worked on the project. They examined the chemical formulations. They analyzed the results. And they came to the conclusion that Dr. Ambros was telling the truth. The deliberate errors were there in the notebooks. The contamination patterns didn't match natural variation. The results showed a clear pattern of degradation that suggested intentional sabotage. So the Americans faced a dilemma. Dr. Ambros was a Nazi scientist. He had worked for the Nazi regime. He had participated in a weapons program. By any definition, he was a war criminal. He should have been prosecuted. He should have been sent to trial. He should have faced punishment for his work. But he had also been sabotaging the program. He had been resisting. He had been working against the Nazi regime from within. He had prevented the Nazis from developing a reliable chemical weapon. He had potentially saved thousands or millions of lives. The Americans decided to be pragmatic. They decided that Dr. Ambros's contributions to sabotaging the chemical weapons program outweighed his participation in the program itself. They decided that a man who had spent years secretly fighting the Nazi regime from within deserved some consideration. They decided not to prosecute him. Instead, they recruited him. The Americans wanted to learn everything they could about German chemical weapons research. They wanted to understand what the Nazis had developed, what they had learned, what they were close to achieving. So they hired Dr. Ambros to work for them. They brought him to America. They put him to work in American chemical weapons research. This created an enormous moral problem. Dr. Ambros, the man who had sabotaged the Nazi chemical weapons program because he believed it was wrong, was now working for the American chemical weapons program. He was doing the exact work he had been resisting. He was helping America develop chemical weapons, the very thing he had fought against. We don't know if he felt conflicted about this. We don't know if he tried to sabotage the American program like he had sabotaged the Nazi program. The historical record is unclear, but we do know that he eventually returned to Germany. He worked in the chemical industry. He published scientific papers. He lived until the 1970s, and that's one of the most interesting parts of his story. Unlike Albert Goering, who lived in relative anonymity, but was recognized by survivors, Dr. Ambros's story was almost completely forgotten. Most people don't know about him. Most historians don't focus on him. Most books about Nazi chemical weapons don't mention his sabotage. It's like he vanished from history. Why? Part of it is because the American military didn't want people to know. They had recruited a Nazi scientist to work for them. That looked bad. That looked like they were covering up war crimes. So they kept quiet about it. They buried the story. They classified the documents. Part of it is because the sabotage was so subtle. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic in a conventional sense. There were no dramatic confrontations. There were no escape attempts. There was no armed resistance. It was just a man quietly introducing errors into chemical synthesis. It was just a man making sure that nerve agents didn't work properly. It was invisible resistance. But that's exactly what made it so powerful. That's exactly what made it so important. Dr. Ambros proved that you didn't need to be a famous resistor to fight the Nazi regime. You didn't need to be a military officer plotting to kill Hitler. You didn't need to be a diplomat passing intelligence to the Allies. You didn't need to be leading an underground network. You could be a chemist. You could work inside the system. You could use your expertise and your position to sabotage the system from within. You could spend years introducing subtle errors into weapons programs. You could prevent mass destruction without anyone knowing what you were doing. Like Albert Goering, Dr. Ambros was a man who used his privilege and his position to resist the Nazi regime. Albert had family connections and access to bureaucracy. Dr. Ambros had scientific expertise and access to a weapons facility. Both of them exploited their positions to fight the system from within. Both of them risked everything. Both of them survived. But also, like Albert Goering, Dr. Ambros's story has largely been forgotten. It's not taught in schools. It's not featured in major historical works. It's not celebrated as a great example of resistance. It's obscured. It's buried. It's hidden. The real tragedy is that we don't know how many other scientists did the same thing. We don't know how many other experts in Nazi weapons programs deliberately sabotaged their work. We don't know how many other people found ways to resist from within. The historical record is incomplete. The documents have been destroyed or classified. The survivors are dead. The witnesses are gone. But we know that Dr. Ambros did it. We know that one man, working inside a Nazi chemical weapons facility, made a decision that could have changed the course of the war. We know that he chose to resist. We know that he chose to make the weapons ineffective. We know that he chose humanity over ideology. And that's why his story matters. Because it shows that even in the darkest system, even inside the most brutal regime, even within a Nazi weapons facility, there were people who found ways to resist. There were people who chose to fight back. There were people who used whatever power and privilege they had to sabotage the machine from within. Dr. Ambros wasn't a famous resistor. He didn't become a celebrated hero. He didn't write memoirs or give speeches. He didn't seek recognition. He just did his job. He just went to work every day at a Nazi chemical weapons facility. He just quietly introduced errors into synthesis procedures. He just made sure that the nerve agents didn't work. But in doing so, He may have saved thousands of lives. He may have prevented chemical weapons from being used on the battlefield. He may have changed the course of the war in ways we'll never fully understand. After the war, when asked why he did it, Dr. Ambros said something simple. He said that what the Nazis were asking him to do was wrong. He said that he couldn't participate in creating weapons designed to kill. He said that he had to find a way to resist, even if that resistance was invisible, even if it was dangerous, even if he was the only one who knew what he was doing. It's a simple answer, but it's also a profound answer, because it suggests that Dr. Ambros, like Albert Goering, never truly accepted the Nazi ideology. He went through the motions. He wore the uniform of Nazi science. He participated in Nazi research, but he never believed in it, and he used whatever power he had to resist it. The real story of Dr. Ambros isn't a story of a Nazi hero. It's not a story of someone who overcame great odds and defeated evil. It's not a story of someone who single-handedly stopped the Nazi chemical weapons program. It's a much smaller story. It's a story of a man who did what he could. It's a story of someone who used his expertise to sabotage a weapons program. It's a story of someone who chose to resist when he could have collaborated. It's a story of someone who chose to save lives when he could have taken them. And that's why it matters. Because it shows that resistance takes many forms. It's not just dramatic confrontations and armed rebellion. It's not just famous plots and celebrated heroes. Sometimes resistance is invisible. Sometimes it's a chemist introducing subtle errors into synthesis procedures. Sometimes it's bureaucrat forging documents. Sometimes it's an actor giving people visas. Sometimes it's a man quietly sabotaging a weapons program for years without anyone knowing. And that resistance matters. That invisible resistance. That quiet resistance. That resistance from within the system. It matters because it can change lives. It can change the course of history. It can prevent catastrophe. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II that go beyond the propaganda, hit subscribe. New videos every week.